Hello and welcome to Antinatalism This Week. Although I had said that I'd probably not make a weekly update this week because there has been an antinatalist conference and I had been busy listening to them, but I thought I'll make an update anyway. Yesterday was day one of the conference and it was excellent. We had David Pierce talking about transhumanism, Seb Alex talking about animal rights, and Mati Hairi. And it was very thought provoking. I mean, all three talks were very thought provoking. Transhumanism, especially, is something I need to explore myself. I haven't read his book, so something I should be doing that. Mati Hairi delved and played with extinctionism, very challenging questions about where to draw the line between antinatalism and pro-extinctionism and all that. So nice work. Seb Alex, animal rights, extremely important a part of antinatalism, I think, because we are bringing animals into the world for our consumption, and that is a great violation of their rights. So very nice. Day one. Looking forward for day two. In the meanwhile, let's have a look at other updates that happened about antinatalism this week. There are many articles on internet which try to criticize antinatalism without even understanding what the argument for antinatalism are. But for a change, we have a very nice article here on findmehobby.com. This, in fact, is an article which should have been covered in my last episode of Weekly Updates. But because I missed it and because this is such a nice article, I thought I should cover it here. FindMeHobby.com, it talks about Antinatalism 101, the history, pioneer, and the concept, and more. Find Me Hobby, Antinatalism is my hobby, by the way. The article is by Laura Hobbies. Well, I guess Laura Hobbies must be just the name from the site. And it explains to a certain extent, which I agree with, about what antinatalism is, what the concept of ethical antinatalism is. And also, so this is here, it says that antinatalism posits that life inherently entails suffering and pain. Advocates of this philosophy believe that refraining from having children, individuals can spare them from the inevitable hardships of existence. This is all, I think, nothing to disagree here. Then it also briefly touches upon environmental antinatalism and then moves on to talk about antinatalism in literature. And it gives three references. The first one is a book called Children of Men. It is by P.D. James. It's a dystopian fictional novel which imagines that there is a generation of humans who can't conceive anymore, and then what happens to them. The next reference is Waiting for Godot, which is a play by Samuel Beckett, very famous play. It doesn't need an introduction from me, but I'll just say this anyway. From what I understood about the play, it has two main characters, as seen here, Vladimir and Estrogan. Estrogan, I think Estragon, something like that. And what they are doing is all throughout the play, they're just waiting for somebody called Godot. It is not clear who Godot is, and it is left up to the spectators, the audience, to interpret what Godot is. Some people think Godot is God, some people think Godot may be meaning of life. I don't think Samuel Beckett has explained what he meant by Godot anyway, and that probably is the idea, that to keep it abstract for people to interpret. But the point is they just keep on waiting for that Godot who never arrives. So the play emphasizes mainly on futility of existence. And if you take that futility in conjunction with the suffering that is entailed in this sentient existence, then that is a very important stepping stone towards antinatalism. So Samuel Beckett's literature in general is more in that direction. I don't think Samuel Beckett ever had any children anyway. So yeah, so the article rightly refers to this play. And the third thing it refers to is a poem called Edge by Sylvia Plath. It's a metaphorical poem of a woman who is dead. It says that the woman is perfected in the sense that she's dead. That's a perfect state. And then the poem, not going to read the poem through, but the poem explains how before dying she had killed her children who have now returned to where they came from by coming into her and so on. So there are all sorts of poetic metaphors in this. I don't think antinatalism, in its straightforward philosophical sense, would say that you should be killing children, but poetic metaphors can be interpreted as saying that see, this is the place of suffering, how bad this is. It would have been better had those children not been born, is what my understanding is. Poetic metaphors have unlimited interpretations. Overall, very good poem, and that is what is being referenced in this article, in this section about literature in antinatalism. After covering the literature part, it then goes into the philosophy of antinatalism. Who are all the pioneers of antinatalism? Of course, it has to refer to David Benatar and his book Better Never to Have Been. In my opinion, it gives a good justice of David Benatar's arguments about explaining antinatalism. It also talks about characteristics of antinatalism, the calculations of pain and pleasure and suffering and existence and non-existence, all of that. So overall, I don't think I disagree a lot of with what has been said here. But then there is this table about positive aspects of antinatalism theory and negative aspects of antinatalism theory. And I want to look a little bit into detail of this. In the positive aspects, it says it reduces suffering, which is true. It actually prevents suffering in some cases by not bringing those beings into existence. It preserves resources, and this preserves resources might is a good in the sense that it helps alleviate suffering of the existing people, their competition for resources, but at the same time it needn't be done with the goal of sustaining all of this for infinite number of years. So preserved resources might need some detailed explanation. Overall, okay, it's a positive aspect. It promotes more ethical society, and I think antinatalist arguments come from the position of compassion, empathy. They are deep arguments. These are characteristics of an ethical society. So I agree that antinatalism promotes ethical society. Negative aspects of antinatalism. It challenges societal norms and expectations. And yeah, okay, it's negative in the sense it is challenging something which exists, but is it really negative? I mean, challenging societal norms is what has brought all of the progress that we have so far. There had been slavery in the past, racism in the past, sexism, women didn't have rights to vote as a societal norm, all of those things, and they have been changed because we have challenged the societal norms at the time. Even homosexuality wasn't looked in a good light at certain times. So challenging societal norms and society and expectations, I'm not sure that is necessarily a negative aspect. I would say that's a positive aspect. It can be viewed, antinatalism can be viewed as pessimistic and nihilistic. Now, I agree to an extent about pessimistic, but this pessimism is philosophical pessimism. It is not about, oh, I am depressed in my life and therefore my antinatalism is true. That might be true for me, but that doesn't mean that the arguments of antinatalism are correct. They are correct from a philosophical pessimistic point of view, and from that point of view, it can be thought of as pessimistic. I don't think antinatalism is nihilistic in the sense, if you're considering moral nihilism, where the framework which says that, nothing matters, there's no value, so you can do whatever you want, there is nothing bad, nothing good, nothing wrong, nothing right. I don't think antinatalism is that. Antinatalism has a certain value-based position towards our actions, and therefore it is not nihilistic in the moral terms. Then it says that this may lead to decline in population, and okay, for some it might be a negative aspect, but it is also a positive aspect in two different ways. One is if you're talking about the topical situation of the earth and we have these many 8 billion, we are overpopulated, and if it declines the population, it is good, so it's not negative. But if you take the core antinatalist argument, then presence of one person is also an overpopulation, and at least in case of humans, and therefore decline of population is always going to be a good thing from antinatalist perspective. So that's not necessarily a negative aspect. It can be a negative aspect, and we'll be talking about that, but later on. So let's scroll down to another table, another evaluative table, which talks about pros of antinatalism and cons of antinatalism. There's some repetition in terms of negative and positive aspects, but some differences also. So let's look at them. One is reducing suffering. Antinatalism aims to prevent suffering by not bringing new individuals into existence. I agree, nothing to disagree there. Just a point to note here is that the individuals here can mean humans if you are human-centric antinatalist, or it can mean sentient being if you are a sentiocentric antinatalist. Environmental sustainability. By having fewer or no children, antinatalists argue that it helps reduce strain on limited resources and mitigates environment degradation. This is yes, if you consider the present situation of the existing people. But I would be very careful about talking about sustainability in the light of antinatalism, because those who are for sustainability generally want to continue this cycle for infinite number of years. Whereas there are some antinatalists who are not entirely for that. And this brings us on to the question talked about in yesterday's debate also, that antinatalism versus pro extinctionism and the fine line dividing that and all that. But I would be very careful about talking sustainability, especially even though reducing the environmental stress is going to help alleviate suffering of existing people, which is in line in general with antinatalism. Okay, next pro, okay, personal autonomy. Antinatalism emphasizes the right of individuals to make choices about their own lives, including whether or not to have children. True, I mean, antinatalism talks about moral right and not about legal right of procreation. I don't think any serious antinatalist would be for punishing somebody for having children. But at the same time, it's not just antinatalism which emphasizes on right of individuals to make choices. It might also be pro-choice individuals in case of abortion debate and so on. So personal autonomy is a characteristic in antinatalism, but I don't think it's a defining characteristic. Yeah, it may be a pro, that much I can agree. What about cons of antinatalism? It goes against human nature, which ties to back to our challenging societal norms. Having children is considered as a natural instinct of many individuals, and I don't think that's a con. I mean, aggression is thought of as a natural instinct of individuals, and it is thought that it is good that we challenge our aggressive nature, our aggressive attitudes. So I think it's an appeal to nature that is a fallacy that is going on here. Just because we are challenging a natural instinct doesn't mean that it's a con. It might even be a pro. That's that. Potential loss of positive experiences. Antinatalism rejects the potential for joy, love, and meaningful experiences that procreating can bring. I don't think they are talking about the potential joy, love of the being who is going to be brought into existence. They are talking about potential joy and meaningful experiences of parents who are going to have a child. And I don't think antinatalism rejects that offhand. Yes, it does reject it eventually, but only after comparing the value that is added to these parents against the suffering of the being without their consent and the risks to which they are exposed to as a result of bringing them into existence. After doing that calculation, it rejects it. It just doesn't reject it offhand. That's my point. And therefore, I think that rejection is not necessarily a con. I think it's a good thing. We should reject that if we compare it to some greater suffering. Decline of human population. If widely adopted, antinatalism could result in declining population and potential societal changes. There are some inaccuracies in this statement. First of all, if you are human-centric antinatalist, then okay, that's right. But there are many antinatalists who are sentiocentric, not just human-centric. In that case, not only decline of human population, but they want decline of population of sentient beings themselves. The second thing is, if widely adopted, antinatalism could result in declining population. This is a pro and con as well at the same time, because this is good and bad at the same time. Why is this good? If you are an antinatalist, from an antinatalist perspective, it's good that there are less people, less beings who are brought into this suffering existence. Why is it bad? Because we already have these many people here. So as we start reducing the population, there would be some economic problems, societal problems, cultural problems. And that has been explained in detail in chapter 6 on extinctionism by David Panettone. Briefly, the if you imagine a phased out extinction just of humans for the sake of argument, then the last generation is going to suffer the most. The one before that is going to suffer a lot, but a little less than the last one, and so on. So as the phasing out goes, there would be suffering. Is that a bad thing or good thing? It is bad thing because there's suffering. But it is also good thing in the sense it is lesser bad compared to other results. What are the other options? That we continue with whatever population we have for billions and billions of infinite numbers of years in the future, where we keep on creating this cycle of new suffering beings. Compared to that, this is a lesser bad. So it's good only in the sense of lesser bad. It is still bad. And therefore it is good and bad at the same time. And therefore I'm not sure if it is clearly con or pro. I might categorize it in both. Those were the things. Overall, I like the article because we find so many articles which are so not researched well, not written well, and just talking, spewing hatred about antinatalism and antinatalist philosophers. But this one, comparatively at least, was a nice article which I like. There was a paper, and it's more about child free than antinatalism. Nonetheless, it talks about the predictors of prejudice, like where is the prejudice towards child-free individuals coming from? And this is a study specifically made in Poland. So it's about child-free people in Poland, what prejudices they face, and where are those prejudices? What are the roots of those prejudices? That is what this study is talking about. What it concludes, I'm just going to briefly talk about it. It says that the study isolated four predictors of prejudice towards the child-free individuals: right-wing authoritarianism, political beliefs, collective narcissism, and religiosity. These provide a better understanding of possible origin of prejudice towards child-free individuals and allow us to explore the relation between these predictors in the future. So yeah, these four are fairly commonly seen roots of prejudice towards people who don't have children. So overall good study which was published recently. There is a series of articles published on theconversation.com about having children. This is almost all published in the last week on different aspects of having children. Whether should I should have children, what is the cost of having children, what if you're a single parent, what is the connection of having children and climate crisis, and so on. One of the articles which was philosophically interesting was Should I Have Children and What Do Philosophers Say About It? So the article briefly touches upon philosophical aspects of antinatalism, the history of antinatalism, and even refers to David Benetta's book and one of his quotes about antinatalism. But it very quickly jumps on to problems with antinatalism. It says that having children is part of the canvas on which ethics is painted rather than the part of the picture. The ethical picture can change, but the canvas is not optional. Now, I'm not sure why this should be the case. We all act for procreation, we do the act of procreation, so it definitely is part of our ethics. And then, as a result of procreation, somebody is coming into existence and we should be evaluating whether that is good or bad, and therefore the phenomenon of coming into existence should be part or in the scope of ethics. I don't know why that should be kept out of ethics. Another problem with this line of thinking is that we have this concept of reproductive rights based on reproductive autonomy, and if the act of procreation is out of the scope of ethics, how can we even construct such rights? Then it says individuals can choose to procreate or not to procreate, but rejecting parenthood entirely has no place within a good society. If you consider antinatalism as a rejectionist philosophy, then it is a perfectly valid question to ask, why should there be a society at all? This leans a little bit towards extinctionism, and in yesterday's conference also we had some points discussed about the differences between antinatalism and pro-extinctionism. But the question, even in the scope of antinatalism, is valid to at least ask, why should we have a society in the first place, let alone a good or bad society? So the assumption here is that we should have a good society, and then we are saying that procreation should not be part of ethics. But that assumption itself is not valid when we are talking about antinatalism. And therefore, this is not a problem with antinatalism. Then the article tries to justify the act of procreation through philosophical benefits of parenthood. And it lists down a few things. One of the things it says is that Buddhists celebrate the rebirth of enlightened human into a world of suffering in the hope that they may help other beings, and they link to a word called samsar or samsara in Britannica.com. The word that samsar, the word actually comes from Vedic literature. From it has references to it in Rigved and Upanishads, which are Hindu literature or Hindu or Brahminic literature in the past. And what that means is this place, Sausar, is a place where the cycle of birth and rebirth is taking place, and it is generally not seen as a good place to be. And therefore, the goal of every at least human being, as these religions prescribe, is to get liberated from this place and from this cycle of birth and rebirth. That liberation in Hinduism is called moksha, in Buddhism, it is called nirvana. And this concept is also there in Jainism, in Indian religions in general. So there are quite a few inaccuracies in this sentence. One, it is not just Buddhists, it is across many Indian religions. Second, I'm not sure if the celebration of birth or rebirth for enlightenment is the actual focus of this concept. The main focus is to get liberated from this place which is full of suffering. Then it says that while non existence would avoid many bad things, new humans carry the possibility of making the future better than the past. Losing such hope for the future would be terrible all around. Now, if you agree that non existence would avoid many bad things, and if you think that is a good thing, then the question is the better future is for whom? If they don't exist, if nobody exists, what is the better future for? I think non existence would be better than having a better future as a mitigating process or as a cure for the sufferings that are created. So these were some of the inaccuracies in the article. I have not pointed out all of it. Rest of the article just talks about some meaning in life and women should have right to reproduce and so on. So there's a lot, not much philosophical content in the rest of the article. There are many articles these days which present antinatalism in a completely distorted view and spread misunderstandings about antinatalism. And I think it is very important to point out those misunderstandings and correct them so that antinatalism doesn't get an unnecessarily bad reputation. One of the examples of this was on the locallondon.co.uk, and the article was Young Reporter, The History of Antinatalism by Luco Lo Presti STH. And I don't know what Luco Lo Presti STS SGS means. Maybe that's the author of the article, but it talks about antinatalism and it has some major inaccuracies in what it is saying. It talks about David Benatar's asymmetry argument. And while talking about that, it says that the asymmetry argued between two scenarios. One where the person in question ceased to exist, and one where the person does exist. That is completely inaccurate. The two scenarios which David Benatar talks about in his axiological asymmetry are not where the person ceased to exist. The one scenario is where the person has not yet come into existence as a potential person, with the person who already exists, like if that person comes into existence. These are the scenarios they're talking about. So if your starting is such horribly wrong, the conclusions you're going to draw from that are definitely going to be wrong. Then it says, you will find that advocates of antinatalism often have a distorted view of the world. I don't think antinatalists have a distorted view of the world. People like these who are writing these articles have distorted view of antinatalism. Antinatalists, more or less, have a realistic view of the world. It is a world, it's a bad place. Philosophers, serious philosophers, agree with this view. Even the pro-natalist philosophers like Jordan Peterson at least agree to the extent that this is not a good place to be in. It also says one's hatred for the world is proportional to their reluctance to bring people into this world. Now, if you're familiar with philanthropic arguments of antinatalism, it is exactly the opposite. It is not hatred for the world, but the empathy towards the beings who will suffer if they're brought into existence is what drives antinatalists towards antinatalism. So this is completely misrepresentative what antinatalism is and what antinatalists are. And then it concludes whether we will be forced to confront these principles or whether antinatalism will become another baseless theory still remains to be seen. One thing is for certain, though, life is worth living. I don't think antinatalism confronts with life worth living in this sense. Life worth living is an ambiguous statement. There is a difference between starting a new life and continuing to live an existing life. The part where continuing to live an existing life, we can evaluate whether that life is worth living for the person who is living that life. But For starting the new life, it's a completely different metric. Antinatalism is talking about starting new life or opposing starting new life. So I think concluding this article about antinatalism with such an ambiguous statement in and of itself does not do any justice towards antinatalism. In some cases, there are people writing these articles against antinatalism with they have a lot of hatred in their heart towards these philosophers. One of the examples is this particular article named The Spectre of Fascism Haunts Hatred of Kids. And the article starts with people who hate children, who don't like children, and it includes sometimes child-free people also. But then it connects that hate towards children or that dislike of children into many different antinatalist aspects. It mixes David Benatar and it also mixes environmental antinatalism. So let's have a look what exactly it says about David Benatar. It says, take the earwax infused philosopher David Benatar, who argues by creating a person, you are introducing them to suffering that they wouldn't have experienced in non existence. Well, first of all, if you're calling David Benatar earwax infused philosopher, that tells me that you have a hatred towards this philosopher. So, an author who is talking against hating children actually is expressing their hatred towards the philosopher. The other thing is that this hatred might be a symptom of one or both things. One is you either have not understood the arguments for antinatalism, or it is very hard for you to refute those arguments because you just don't like them. There was no need to call David Benatar as earwax infused philosopher. Nonetheless, after just referring to this much, the author slips very quickly to saying that eco-fascists are often anti-natalists, viewing a climbing population as ecosystemic nightmare and generally holding that less people will solve the climate crisis. This position ought to always be viewed with suspicion because it conveniently does not account for the wealthiest 10% of the people in the world producing a whopping 50% of all emissions worldwide according to 2015 Oxfam report. Now, there are quite a few inaccuracies in just this part of the article. One, David Benatar's antinatalism is different than environmental antinatalism. Two, calling environmental eco-fascist is not actually accurate because people who are concerned about environment are concerned about suffering of existing people. And that is why some of them are antinatalists because they don't want to have children. I have said this in the past that personally my antinatalism does not stem from environmental antinatalism, but even then, this sort of statement has some inaccuracies. It's very fashionable to say that only minority of people are producing majority of emissions, and therefore environmental antinatalism is not correct. This is based on the assumption that all that majority of the people who are not producing emissions today are going to remain in poverty such that they cannot produce these emissions. That is the assumption on which this argument is based. And that assumption itself, keeping them in poverty, is a fascist assumption. And therefore, it can be dismissed all the way like that. There are even some articles who put on a guise of intellectualism while criticizing antinatalism on a very superficial level. It's okay to criticize antinatalism, on a deeper level, talking about philosophical arguments and so on, but without even understanding or reading the books that you claim to criticize, that is, I don't know if it is honest. And one of such articles is The Selfishness of the World Saving Antinatalists on intellectualtakeout.org, and it is criticizing antinatalism. It is also presented a tweet from Lawrence, and then it talks about David Benatar's Better Never to Have Been. And I quote, in this vein, one antinatalist philosopher titled his book Better Never to Have Been, The Harm of Coming into Existence. I invite the reader to reflect for a minute on that title. The writer did not see a contradiction in his beliefs. On one hand, he points out the horrors of existence, but on the other, he is thankfully sufficiently attached to this awful world to stick around and publish a book on the beliefs. This is just a roundabout way of saying, why don't you kill yourself? And that argument has been addressed by almost all philosophers talking about antinatalism. Antinatalism is opposition only to creation of new life. Once you are here, you have a very strong interest in continuing to live, continuing to keep on living. As a result, if nothing else, of a long evolutionary biological history that we have. That interest is within us. We can't help or we can't get rid of that interest, or at least it is not easy to do that. And therefore, the part of continuing to live an existing life and not starting a new life are two different things. David Benatar has explained about this to a great detail in many different ways, in many different books, including Better Never to Have Been. So, putting this in this way and pretty much kill yourself argument for David Benatar, I think tells that you actually even haven't read the book, even the start of the book. And then it continues in different aspects about having children, how our ancestors have cared for their children, how our parents have cared for us, and therefore we should continue this chain, and not continuing this chain is actually selfish. Calling antinatalists or even child-free people selfish is so old school now that this article really makes me really cringe. What is selfish is to continue this cycle of suffering. There was a good discussion about whether or not antinatalism should include animals, what the definition of antinatalism is, and so on. It's a good discussion on question mark. I think it's Mark's channel on which they are discussing about these topics. I liked the discussion. I have some opinions on it, but I thought that they were, a lot of focus on the definition, like defining antinatalism in certain set of words, rather than the view and what the idea is. That's what I thought. I might be completely wrong here, but these are the discussions I would, I generally am interested in as an antinatalist. So good discussion, I think, and that's what I thought I should highlight that in this update. There's a new podcast called Bias in Birth. It is talking about antinatalism. There are two antinatalists, and I think one of them even has a child, but he still agrees with antinatalism. There are a lot of people like that. Overall, good. The more podcasts about antinatalism we have, the better. So yes, please go and subscribe. Nice episode to start with. And those were the updates for this week about antinatalism. I'm sure I must have missed a lot. Please let me know what I've missed. I'm also looking forward to day two, which is today, my evening, for the next part of the antinatalist conference. Let's see what happens. Exciting times. Thank you.